Good afternoon, students. Welcome to this analysis session on PGDBA 2022. As you all know, PGDBA is a common program offered by IIM Calcutta, IIT Kharagpur, and ISI Calcutta. So this exam was held today in the morning from 9 to 12. Now, one deviation in the pattern of this exam as compared to previous years was that there was slight change in the sections. Earlier, logical reasoning used to be a separate section of 5 questions. So in this year's exam, it was combined with verbal ability. So there were 20 questions in all in verbal ability and logical reasoning section. So 15 were on verbal ability and 5 were on LR, logical reasoning. Then, as usual, there were 25 questions on quant and 5 questions on data interpretation and what they say data interpretation with data visualization. Now, when it comes to level of difficulty, as usual, the quantitative aptitude section was on difficult side. However, the other 3 sections were relatively much more straightforward. So we'll come to the analysis of individual section in just a moment from now. But before that, just one small point that as usual, the marking scheme for the exam was +3 and -1. That is +3 marks for correct answer and negative marking of 1 mark for incorrect answers. And there was no penalty for unattempted questions. Now, this is the verdict based on the feedback that we have received from our students and based on the feedback that we received from IMS mentors who appeared for the exam, that this year's exam was slightly more difficult than the previous year's exam. So what we believe is a score of something like 100 to 103 should be good enough for getting a call for interviews for the next round of admissions. Of course, this is for general category of students. So just remember this number, 100 to 103. So this is what we estimate. Now coming to the analysis of individual sections. Firstly, verbal ability and logical reasoning section. There were 20 questions in this. Out of these 20 questions, 15 questions were on verbal ability and 5 questions were on logical reasoning, as we discussed some time back. So out of 15 questions on verbal ability, 10 questions were on reading comprehension. And out of which there were 2 passages and each passage has had 5 questions each. And we could say about 8 questions out of 10 were easy to medium and 2 questions were somewhat tricky. Overall, both the passages were relatively straightforward understanding. So there were no very complicated ideas and very complicated issues and presentation involved in that. In addition to that, there were 2 questions based on vocabulary. So one was on fill in the blanks with 3 blanks, and there was 1 question on analogy. Although that question was slightly differently worded, yet the nature of the question was analogy. And the question on verb fill in the blank was, we are categorizing it as difficult only because it could be attempted by students only those students who understood the meaning of the words involved well. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been possible. And in addition to that, there were 3 parajumbles, and each parajumble had 4 sentences. And it is, though all the 3 questions on parajumble were also relatively straightforward. So what we say is that an attempt of about 12 to 13 questions in our 30 minutes in verbal ability should be good enough. Of course, this 12 to 13 questions out of 15 questions on verbal ability. And in addition to that, there were 5 questions on logical reasoning in this section. So those 5 questions were based on there was only 1 set on circular arrangement. And there were no verbal reasoning question and there were no standalone question in this section. This set, we would say it was not very straightforward. It was, we would categorize it at medium level of difficulty. But of course, after having appeared for CAT and prepared for CAT for almost 1 year or so, most of you would have found this set doable, and especially when we have 180 minutes. all 3 hours to attempt the entire exam. Okay, so time is usually not a constraint in PGDBA exam. So what we say is you should have attempted, you should have aimed at attempting all the 5 questions in on this circular arrangement set, maybe in 15 to 20 minutes. So overall, about an attempt of 17 to 18 out of 20 in about 45 to 50 minutes. Now, why we are saying that you should have attempted 17 to 18 questions out of 20? See, because the reason is when we say that the cutoff we are expecting is something like 100 to 103. Okay, so let's do some back calculations. So that means you should get about 37, 38 questions. You should attempt total about 37 to 38 questions. And out of which 25 questions out of 50 are from QA section, and out of which a lot of about 14 questions were on higher mathematics, which are those the kind of questions which are not asked in CAT. Okay, so in case you may not be able to attempt all those questions, therefore what we say is you should aim at attempting all the questions in other sections. Okay, or rather most of the questions in other sections. That's why we are saying something like attempt of 17 to 18 questions out of 20 would have been a good attempt in BA and LR section. And then moving on to next section, that is data interpretation and data visualization section. There were 5 questions in this, and most important thing is all the 5 questions are standalone questions. So there was no set in this section. And out of these 5 questions, 4 questions were on tables and 1 question was on histogram. And these questions were based on very simple elementary calculations and observation. Okay? So obviously you should have attempted all the 5 questions in about max 10 to 15 minutes. That was very much doable. Okay? Especially for students who are appeared for CAT and who have been preparing for CAT for almost a year. Okay? So that was possible. Now, moving to the most important section in this exam, that is QA section, which is 25 questions out of 50, which amounts to almost half of the entire exam is devoted to this section. Now, as you know, the differentiating factor of this PGDBA test from other tests that you have taken so far, for example, say CAT or ZAT or NMAT or SNAP or other tests, or say IIFT for that matter, is that there are questions on higher mathematics in this section in PGDBA test. So what we mean by higher mathematics is some questions on say conic sections or integration or some such topics which are not asked at CAT level. But usually these type of questions you have studied in +2 level. So this is one differentiating factor of PGDBA test. And usually over the years, about 11 to 15 questions have been on higher mathematics over the years in PGDBA test. Now this year there were 14 questions out of 25. Okay? Now obviously these topics included calculus, conic sections, and even in algebra. So out of 11 questions which were at CAT level of or which dealt with syllabus of CAT, algebra dominated this section. Okay. Now overall, what we categorize is that this section was difficult. Okay. Overall level of difficulty was high, and what we say is a good attempt should be around 16 to 17 questions in about 110 to 120 minutes. Okay? So your strategy should have been to attempt at least about 16, 17 questions in this section, QA section, and most of the questions from the other section, so that your overall attempt could go up to something like 37, 38, 39. Okay? So that would have helped you clear the cutoff. Now moving to the type of questions that were asked in this section. So as you can see, higher mathematics, out of 14 questions, 10 questions were difficult. Okay, and 4 questions were medium. Then there were questions on algebra, modern mathematics, numbers, and geometry. Yeah, so all these question types. So these topics are also will look familiar to you because they are dealt with at CAT level of difficulty as well. However, there is one striking feature of this year's PGDBA that is somewhat deviant from the previous year's PGDBA exam, is that in the earlier years, what used to happen is the questions at only the questions on higher mathematics used to be difficult, no doubt about it. However, the other questions, the questions that were at CAT level, were somewhat similar to CAT level of difficulty. However, in this year's exam, one striking feature that I found was some of the questions, although those questions dealt with similar topics, similar concepts that are dealt with at CAT level, yet the way they structured the questions and the way they asked the questions made it slightly more tricky than last year. Okay, so that's the only reason that we are categorizing this exam, this year's exam, as slightly more difficult than the previous. Okay. However, there were some rather very easy questions. I would say a couple of very easy questions. There was one question on numbers. The highest power of a certain number in a particular factorial. So you would have saw umpteen number of such questions in your CAT preparation. So that such questions would have been like a cakewalk for you. Okay, so you should have definitely not missed those questions. Okay? And both the questions on geometry were on trigonometry. Okay? And one question on trigonometry involved heights and distances. That was also a very easy question. Okay, so the point is you shouldn't have missed out on these very easy questions. Okay, so the idea is out of these topics such as algebra, modern maths, numbers, and geometry, whichever easy and medium level of difficulty questions that you could find, you shouldn't have missed a single one of them. Okay, and because time is not a constraint for PGDBA exam, you should have spent more time, of course. Students who brushed up their concepts of calculus and conic sections and those concepts well could have devoted more time out of 180 minutes to higher mathematics and would have been able to attempt at least say 7, 8, 9 questions out of this out of these 14 questions. Okay? Then moving on to the detailed breakup of questions on higher mathematics. Now there were 4 questions on conics and circles. Well, there was one question that could have been categorized as a part of algebra as well. However, the options involved some equations. And one of the equations was circles, equation of a circle, and the other equations were the equations of conic circle, conic sections. And that's the only reason we are categorizing that question under conics and circles. So 1 medium and 3 difficult, total 4. And then there were 2 questions on limits and continuity, 4 questions on matrices and determinants. Okay? So this question type has made its presence felt in this year's exam. 4 questions on matrices and determinants. Then there were only 2 questions on integration. Okay? So one question was definitely doable, and the other one was slightly more tricky. So obviously, that question could have been attempted only by those students who were thorough with those concepts of integration. And there were a couple of questions on advanced functions. So what we mean by advanced functions is the topics were related to functions, but the kind of questions that were asked were at higher level of difficulty as compared to CAT. Okay? So our overall analysis is it was one notch more difficult than the previous year because of the reasons that we discussed earlier. That even the questions at CAT level syllabus were more tricky, and that is what made this section slightly more challenging. Okay? So as we mentioned earlier, we expect a cutoff of something like 100 to 103 in this year's PGDBA exam. Based on the feedback that we have received from our students who appeared for PGDBA interview last year and the previous years, they also asked a number of questions on the concepts in higher mathematics in the interview. Okay, so you still have about 4 to 6 weeks before your interviews begin. Okay, so it would help if you just brush up all those concepts of integration and derivatives and calculus limits, as well as conic sections and all those topics. Okay, so that's it from me at this point. Okay, thank you.